Hi, I'm Mandy Medley. I'm one of the worker owners here at Pilsen Community Books, which is a worker cooperative and independent bookstore here in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. And I'm so excited to welcome you here tonight for a very special evening with Anjali Enjeti, Kwon, and Suchitra Vijayan, and it's just going to be wonderful, so thanks for joining us. A couple of notes about how this evening will go. First, I'll introduce tonight's guests, and then the three of them will be in convo. And then there will be time for a few questions at the end. So if you have any questions at all during the event, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll make sure they get to our guests at the right time. I do see a question, will this be available for replay after the live event? Yes, it will on our Pilsen Community Books YouTube channel. You'll be able to share it and see it then. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you can purchase all of the author's books, including a pre-order for Midnight's Borders, at our website at pilsencommunitybooks.com. And if we do have any technical difficulties and the stream's interrupted for any reason, you again can visit our YouTube channel, pilsencommunitybooks.com, and we will resume streaming there as soon as everything works out. But I anticipate no technical difficulties. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's guests. Anjali Enjeti is a former attorney, organizer, and award-winning journalist based near Atlanta. She is the author of the essay collection Southbound, Essays on Identity, Inheritance, and Social Change, which is just out this month, and it's excellent, and a novel, The Parted Earth, out next month. Her writing about politics, social justice, and books has appeared in Harper's, BAZAAR, ZORA, Courier Newsroom, Mike, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Washington Post, Al Jazeera, The Nation, and elsewhere. She is a co-founder of They See Blue Georgia, an organization for South Asian Democrats, and in 2020 she served on the Georgia Biden-Harris AAPI Leadership Council. Kwon's nationally best-selling first novel, The Incendiaries, is published by Riverhead, and it is being translated into 7 languages. Named a Best Book of the Year by over 40 publications, The Incendiaries received a Housatonic Book Award and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, John Leonard Award, Los Angeles Times Art Seidenbaum Prize, and the Northern California Independent Booksellers Association Fiction Prize. Kwon's writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Paris Review, New York Magazine, NPR, and elsewhere. Named by the New York Times as one of 4 writers to watch, she has received awards from the National Endowments for the Arts, Yaddo, and MacDowell. Kwon and Garth Greenwell co-edited the best-selling Kink, which is a bestseller at our store too, an anthology published by Simon & Schuster. Suchitra Vijayan was born and raised in Madras, India. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, GQ, the Boston Review, The Hindu, and Foreign Policy. A barrister by training, she has previously worked at the United Nations War Crimes Tribunals in Yugoslavia and Rwanda before co-founding the Resettlement Legal Aid Project in Cairo, which gives legal aid to Iraqi refugees. She is an award-winning photographer, the founder and executive director of the Polis Project, a hybrid research and journalism organization. Her book, Midnight's Borders, A People's History of Modern India, which again you can pre-order on our website, is published by Melville House this May, I think. And with that, I'll turn it over to Anjali.
Thank you so much, Mandy. I want to thank everybody at Pilsen Community Books as well for this wonderful opportunity to be with these writers that I admire so much and to be in community with all of you readers out there. We wanted to take a minute just to acknowledge that we know that this is a really difficult time for everybody. And because of that, we are especially grateful to be in this space with you all this evening, and we want to send all of you love and light. What we'd like to do over the next hour is talk about what it means to speak out, whether that's in our writing, whether that's online or in person. And in asking this question, we are very conscious of the fact that historically women, femmes, trans, non-binary folks, including those who are Black and Native and Arab and Asian and Latinx, are oftentimes penalized for speaking out. So the way we're going to start this evening is having each of us pose a question. that all three of us are going to answer. And we hope that you all drop some questions that you all have in the comments that we can answer towards the end of the program. So I'm going to turn it over to Suchitra to have her ask the first question.
Thank you, Anjali. I just want to thank Mandy for putting and having all of us together, Anjali for bringing us and creating this community, and Reese, again, lovely to be here with you. I'm going to start off with the first question. And the first question is something that's really important to me, because as Asian American women, we continue to be at the receiving end of many kinds of stereotypes, which can affect our opportunities or ability to speak out. Sometimes it's erasure, sometimes it is silencing, and sometimes also self-censorship. We oftentimes are made to feel as if we shouldn't be seen or heard. So my question to both of you is, how have these stereotypes affected whether or how you tell your truths and tell your stories?
I'm happy to start. Thank you to Mandy, and thank you to the bookstore, and thank you, Anjali. Thank you, Suchitra. I'm very glad to be here with you all. 1 second, sorry. I'm just coughing. Okay, all right, everything's good. Well, let's see. For me, so I write fiction and I write nonfiction, and I start with that because even though I write a lot of nonfiction, I think of myself much more as a novelist, or rather, I feel much more alive when I'm writing fiction. And so that's sort of where I feel as though fiction is the temple at which I serve, and then the other stuff is stuff I also do, which kind of changes matters, I think, in that the place where I'm spending the most of the bulk of like sort of my imaginative time, my writing time, the place where my heart is more is in a realm where everything is being made up, so in a way that could provide, I suppose, what could feel like infinite freedom, and or infinite additional complexities that come from that infinite freedom. And I guess what I'll say is, on the one hand, I am always conscious. It is impossible not to be aware that, say, okay, I'm writing the novel I'm working on right now is about queer Korean women, and queer Korean women haven't been centered very often in American letters. It's impossible not to be aware of that. At the same time, when I'm writing, when I'm deep in the work, when I'm like 3 hours into, if I have the glorious luck of, I don't know, 4 hours to write, and if I'm 3 hours into it, I need to forget that. I need to forget that sort of weight of being one of a few, and I need to write from a place of abundance to a place of abundance. And so I can't do anything that feels as though I'm pleading for my humanity and the humanity of people like me, for instance, is something that I can't do in fiction, because I have to write from a place where there's people like me are plentiful, I guess.
That's such a great question, and such an important question in this moment. So I am most often speaking out as a writer in my nonfiction and as a journalist in my reporting, but most often it is as an organizer in the community. It's with elected officials, with political candidates. It's against a lot of what I'm in the environment I'm in. So it's an expression very often of dissent. It's often public. It's often uncomfortable, and it is challenging people. And I feel very strongly that I'm speaking out against often a system or a law or a policy, and there is a general sort of surprise that I feel is very deeply rooted in race and gender, in the fact that people don't expect me to challenge them in an open forum, for example. It's startling. And I feel like I do get dismissed very often because of multiple reasons, but oftentimes it's because I'm not seen as an expert, which I think is very gendered and racialized. I'm emotionally unstable or inappropriate in how I express myself. I'm angry. That is another a big stereotype that I'm trying to fight against. I'm told the tone of voice is inappropriate. So I'm constantly, and because so much of my work is public, and sometimes what I mean by public, I don't mean with like a giant crowd of people. I mean, oftentimes it's a Zoom call with 10 people, or it's at an event with a candidate, and I'm asking a really pointed question, or I'm challenging their position on something. But I do feel like the stereotypes really affect my ability to be heard, and to be taken seriously. And I think there are many reasons for that. I think Asian American women, obviously this is true of many racial demographics, but as an Asian American woman, I think it's because people expect us to be complacent. People expect us to be accepting of what's going on, or if we are upset by something, people expect us to be quiet about it, to take it gracefully or whatever. So it's been a challenge for me. It's something that I'm constantly struggling with. I'm always trying to refine how I speak out and how I communicate. And then I get upset by that because I'm like, how many other people that are not Asian American women are so conscientious in the way that I have to be to communicate an important point. So it is something that I struggle with on a daily basis. And I'm really looking forward to what you have to say, Suchitra, because I know that a lot of the work that you do is so public and done in public forums.
No, I think for me, it's been a challenge. I'm an immigrant. I'm an immigrant who has occupied spaces that are often very white. I left home when I was 17. Almost every space I've occupied is predominantly white, whether it's going to law school in England, then occupying spaces, whether it was Afghanistan, whether it was Cairo, where all expats who worked with refugees were white. There were very few exceptions. And again, I didn't have an American or a British passport. I traveled with an Indian passport. When I came to this country as a graduate student, again, I realized that I was still one of the few brown, there were no black people. There were still a few brown people. And often I found that there was an urge to convert me into this model minority. Often people would assign caste and class locations to me. People would often come up to me and say, oh, you're so smart, you must be Tamil Brahmin. And I would say I'm not a Brahmin. I think in this case, it's also this concern of caste and class locations. And one is often trying to reclaim a space when you are really trying to make sense of what all of this means. So that's one thing where you don't want to be recast into this model minority. You want to be very sure about where you come from. And often another story that I found quite puzzling is that a lot of South Asians actually very willingly play into this model minority narrative. Recently, a very famous writer of Indian origin said, oh, my father arrived in this country with a thin wallet. But your father also arrived with a phenomenal degree who could speak English, who was a partner at McKinsey. So your experience is not the same as many South Asians or Asian communities. Not everybody had the privilege of flying into this country with a degree. Not everybody had the privilege of being the model minority. And I think there's a vast experience. And I think I often struggle to find a place where I I want to speak my truth without being co-opted into a certain narrative. I do not want to be an eloquent voice of the empire. I do not believe that a brown woman tomorrow heading the CIA or being a part of FBI somehow. Often diversity and representation are not the same things. And again, we've produced so many eloquent brown and black voices of empire. And for me, that is militating against it is very, very important. Another thing that I found was that speaking your truth anywhere has become so difficult. But especially when you speak your truth as a brown woman, you're seen as uppity. I didn't know language like microaggression. I didn't know what gaslighting was. So these are all things that one learns to recognize much later in life. And now, even when writing, hopefully we'll talk about it. There's a conversation I've had with so many of my other friends who are writers, is that one of us doing well does not automatically mean that tomorrow 10 of us will have publishing deals. If one of us does well, then we become the one sole voice. One of us doing well doesn't open up doors. And that's why conversation like these are so important, in that we want to reclaim our space to be who we are. I know it's a cliche, but we are multitudes, right? So for me, that's always been the case. I don't want to place myself as a model minority. I think that's very important for me. I'll kind of leave it at that. I know there's a lot to tease out, but I'll definitely, there's a lot to, especially when you think about writing fiction. I mean, often someone says, when all of us write fiction, are we then only allowed to write about our experiences? Can all of us have a craft? Or can we only speak about our predicament, right? So I think these are all really important questions. I struggle with it. I don't have right answers. Some days it's painful. Some days it's difficult. Some days it stops you from writing. Sometimes and then it takes you. It's again an act of discipline where you teach yourself to write against the sense of fatigue. So I'll kind of leave it at that, and then I'm sure we'll come back and tease out more of these threads.
Should I ask the next question? Yes. Okay. All right. The next question is, how do you divide your time between your own writing and your community work, if you even think of it as a division, or does it all feel like part of the same whole?
I can start. I'll start with one word. I do this terribly. And I'm always seeking from fellow writers, fellow activists, how to do a better job of that. There is a fair amount of overlap between what I do as an organizer at Basie Blue Georgia, and then what I do sort of as I call it my day job, but pretty much everything is happening all the time. This past year for the elections, I was covering the elections regularly for a couple different outlets while I was organizing at the same time. And in some ways, it was actually okay that there was a significant overlap, because my in-person interactions, whether that was meeting a voter outside somewhere or knocking their doors or over the phone, very much informed my reporting about the election. So that was great to have that overlap, because I felt like I was a little bit more in touch with what was happening on the ground, especially in Georgia, which is a state where we have a lot of people outside of Georgia who've never set foot in the state reporting on what's happening in Georgia. Some of them do it very well, but sometimes it's clear that they've really missed the boat on sort of the central struggles that voters face here. So in that respect, it's good. But what I really struggle with as a writer is that I seem to use the same space in my brain to do organizing as I do creative work. So, for example, it's very difficult for me to write fiction while I'm like really in the heart of political work. it's impossible. I just can't even think of I can't think of anything, even if I'm in the beginning of revising a novel, and it's like it just doesn't come to me at all. So I think it is important to draw some kind of boundaries between community work and writing. Unfortunately, I remain incredibly unbalanced and unstable in this respect, and I've not found a way to do it. Interestingly enough, there are a lot of writers who are community organizers and vice versa. But you know, because when you are close to, say, an election, you are basically doing that work 24 hours a day, and you might have spurts of the work with your day job. I also teach in an MFA program, but you are constantly having, everything's an emergency, everything is a crisis. The last 4 months before an election, everything has to be handled immediately. There's not really an option, and the same is true of journalism. So I'm oftentimes just frantically trying to attack many projects at the same time, and there's not that kind of division. But I really think, as a writer, I really hope that I can strive to divide that time better, because I think where my work is suffering most is definitely the creative writing part. I find it really too difficult to do well, to really sort of deeply throw myself into that work. It seems impossible, especially during election time. I was talking to a friend the other day. We have a little bit of a lull right now in Georgia. Our state legislative session, which was a complete nightmare, ended March 31st, and redistricting will start later this year. So our work as an organization isn't really going to pick up really heavily until probably June. So I'm in this space where I'm like, okay, write as much as you can before you have to start thinking about this stuff again. But I'm interested in what you all have to say, and I'll perhaps I should take notes if you have really good methods of how to divide this up in your own lives.
Anjali, I think you're asking advice from the wrong set of people. I mean, I'll speak for myself. You're definitely asking advice from the wrong person. I was having this conversation with my dear friend and one of the other founding members of Polis Project, Francesca, and I just told her that, do you realize that since we started Polis, we are enabling so many other young writer scholars to write, but our own work has suffered. Like, I have 5 essays that I want to finish. I have a fiction project that I started that I'm really excited about, because I've always been so scared of it's a project that has stayed with me. And yet yesterday was supposed to be my first official day off in over a year. And I was just supposed to read and then just prepare for this fiction project and then apply for a bunch of fellowships so that would give me a little bit more resources so that I could. And then the COVID outbreak in India just became difficult, and people just started reaching out and saying, hey, we need this, could you do this? Between 2 and 6, I was literally on calls after the other. And I just felt helpless. It's not about the writing then. And so you've spent 2 to 6 doing this from a relatively comfortable space where, I've kind of, I live in the heart of New York City, despite the pandemic, I've mostly come out of it okay. And yet there are communities that are being completely devastated, right? So this constant back and forth. And I've had this conversation with so many people. And then one thing I've come to realize is that it took me so long to give myself permission to become a writer. I didn't decide. I've wanted to be a writer since I was 8, but I didn't give myself permission to write till I was 28 for so many reasons. And a writer's role, I believe, is to respond to this social moment, this political moment. If my body is just required to just tell someone it's going to be okay, then I will do that. I don't know how that's going to affect my work, but I'm taking comfort in the idea that I'm responding to this moment, and hopefully I will try and be as humane and decent. And I use the word dignity and honor a lot, and then my father always laughs at me and he says, nobody uses the word honor. What's wrong with you? But I think there's something to that word, the dignity, right? Like it might not really show you results today, but just being on a call with someone and telling them it's going to be okay and spending 20 minutes or 40 minutes, I think is important. Yes, I know that I didn't, the day that was supposed to be for my fellowship application and thinking through a fiction project didn't come through. But I hope that these things will make me a better writer. I hope it'll make me a better writer. But no, I think there's just, the thing about being a writer who's also in the real world is that you're constantly getting ideas. Every person I meet is an idea. Every person I meet is an argument. Every person I meet tells me I have to be a better person. So I hope all of this, at least I convince myself that all of this adds up to something. So, but no, the larger question is I do a terrible job. I don't think I have any sense of these boundaries between setting time, and I fail miserably. I wonder what, I want to hear what Reese has to say.
I'm still hanging out, Suchitra, with what you said about how every person you meet makes you want to be a better person. And that's amazing and so enlightened. I feel as though I wish I were that way. And then I don't know. And then sometimes I just end up annoyed or with less generosity in my heart. So I admire.
Oh no, I'm annoyed as well. I'm annoyed a lot more, but.
I was like, damn, I spent a lot of time pissed. You too. Well, I mean, I guess one thing I will say is my community involvement, on the one hand, it's super important to me that with my work and with things tangential to my work, which is also part of my work, but writing adjacent things, it's really important to me that community work is really important to me. That said, I haven't founded an organization the way y'all have. I don't have organizations to which I am also responsible when it comes to community work, really. And so my involvement is different. The timelines and schedules are different. Let's see. What I will say is usually when things get really busy, and let me say, I'm not taking care of, I have no children. I'm not immediately responsible for anyone's daily welfare, which makes it so that it's very possible for me to do things like sleep 2 hours. And that's how I get in my work and my teaching and the writing I want to do and the community work I want to do, there were points during those few months around the elections when not as much as Anjali by any means, but I was also heavily involved in electoral organizing. I was taking I was falling asleep on the floor a lot, like a cat, because and my bedroom was one door over, but I was so tired that I would just be like, well, there's a floor right here. I could just take a quick little nap. It's not a big why go to all the effort to go to another room to lie down when there's space right here? So I just kept falling asleep like a cat, in various parts of the room that I was working in, which is, I guess, just a very long way of saying that I haven't figured out a balance either. One thing I will say is it's helped for people around me, the people I live with. So I'm living with my husband, and for much of the pandemic, I've also been living with his parents. And it's helped that everyone who is close to me believes that I am a better person to be around if I've written that day. And so that, I mean, not that I hope I don't turn into an unconscionable monster. But I do get irritable, and I do get kind of peevish. And my husband, sometimes I'll say, oh, okay, I can be done writing. Yes, I'll come watch a movie with you like a human being. And he'll actually be the one to say no, I want you to write for another hour or so because I love you more when you've written for the day. And so I think that's been helpful. Is just is letting that happen, I think, and helping people around me see that it's a priority too. But yeah, no, I'm not sure what the answer is either. And I feel as though every day I feel as though I haven't written enough. Every week I feel as though I haven't done enough of anything.
So I'm supposed to ask the next question, but I'm looking at the time. So Suchitra, would you mind skipping to your next question? Because I think the next two questions, one from you and one from Reese, are really super important. And I think it'd be great if we could address them before, so that, and then have a little bit of time for any audience questions.
Sure. The question I had is a question that I came up just a couple of hours before this conversation, and it is directly affected by the judgment that came yesterday, the George Floyd judgment that came yesterday, where I really wanted to address this to both of you, where how do we respond to acts of violence that devastate our communities? Whether it is witnessing police violence, whether it's witnessing other kinds of shooting, when at that moment of immense grief and loss, we're also called to speak. We are also called to bear the burden of explaining to our oppressors who we are, or setting the narrative straight. Yeah, I know it's a difficult question, but I really would love to hear from both of you what this burden of speaking, the burden of educating the oppressor, especially when we are in the moment of, yes, great grief, and also our communities face such grief.
So this is such an important question, and I feel like it's one that we all seem to need to ask ourselves every day. And I guess, it's a really fine line, I think, because I am often of two minds. One is, I feel like it's sometimes too much to bear to have the burden of educating oppressors. But then I also feel like, because I have a lot of privilege, I should also bear more of the burden of correcting these harmful narratives, even if I'm in a lot of pain. So I do try to do that, but what I try to do is to for a little bit of self-preservation, I try to sort of pick my battles. So, for example, I'll talk a little bit about what happened with the mass shooting in Atlanta. I live right outside of Atlanta, so we had a lot of media coverage that was local and national. And one of the dominant narratives was started by the shooter himself and was amplified by law enforcement, which was that this crime was a crime motivated by and committed due to a sex addiction. So here we were, doing what we've done for centuries. When we talk and think about Asian women in general, which is over-sexualize them. And this was when we had little knowledge about who the victims were. And it was just this presumption that was suddenly adopted and put on the airwaves and repeated and retweeted. And so I sort of thought a little bit about what my function can be. The Asian women who were killed were Korean and Chinese. And so I did not want to speak out about my own pain in that moment. I was contacted by a lot of media, and instead of offering some kind of quote, I directed them more directly to the communities that were affected. I mean, certainly South Asians, brown people experience hate crimes. But I wanted to make sure that I handed the microphone to the people that were most affected by this horrific crime. So what I came away from then was, well, I'm a journalist. Why don't I then make that how I contribute? by challenging how other journalists are framing this narrative. And so this is what I did. I did it in text groups. I did it in that I'm in with other journalists. I did it with email chains that I'm in with other journalists. And I really tried to challenge their ideas of, and these were non-Asian journalists predominantly, challenge their ideas of how they were covering these stories. And Asian American Journalists Association did a phenomenal job with putting out information about how these stories should be covered. And so I felt like that was one area where I could work to challenge the narrative without centering myself as someone who was, I wasn't targeted. My people were not targeted in this particular crime. So this was a way for me to sort of do some work and make some kind of contribution, but in a way that didn't center myself in some way. So I think finding how we are going to challenge the oppressors narratives is really vital and really crucial. And we also aren't going to be able to do it all. I mean, this is the kind of work where, it's very easy to be harassed or trolled online. It's very easy to burn out if you're trying to fight every single battle out there when these harmful narratives come out. So I think it's important to sort of weigh where you are and where your voice is most helpful when you do speak out, and try not to feel guilty if you're not counteracting everything that's out there, because you're just one individual. So yeah.
One thing, let's see, this is bringing up a lot of thoughts. Just like an overall thought that really does help me is with writing, and especially with book writing, and trying to make space for book writing, which can often feel, I think, really futile, and really it can be hard to feel that it has like an immediate purpose, especially in a time like this when so many people are struggling with needs that can be met that day, and that's not something that a book you're writing can do. That said, I think it has really helped me to keep in mind that I've also never been as desperately hungry for art as I've been in this past year. I've never been more grateful to poetry. There were whole months when I couldn't read anything except the news, but I could still read poetry. And the times when I was reading poetry were some of the only times I genuinely felt alive. And so it is life-saving, it is healing, even if it is in this sort of like longer term, more amorphous way. But in terms of responding to acts of violence in the moment, I think in 2016, I started realizing that I think that's when I started writing a lot more nonfiction that has to do with gender, with race, with sexuality. And I think it was because I realized I was like, well, this was in 2016, and I was just thinking like, okay, I'm terrible at, I was involved in like phone banking and all of that, but I was like, okay, I hate making phone calls. Like, this is just something I'm not that good at doing. I was like, but I can put words into sentences in a way that like seems to have some effect. And I was like, okay, so how can I work with this in a way that could be of use to people, since I hate feeling useless? That was part of it, right? Like I needed to feel useful. And I feel as though that was when I started realizing that I could think about writing nonfiction as being not so much for me, which in a lot of ways fiction is for me. I could think about nonfiction as something I can do that can maybe help a little. And then I think something that's really helped me with being clearer, since I'm always figuring it out and there's always confusion, clearer about why I'm doing something, has been to ask myself who it is I have in mind as an audience, for instance. And so right after the Atlanta shootings, since Anjali brought that up, I think like 3 days after the shootings, I published a piece that was a letter to Asian women. And it was actually really, by like the day after the shooting, so many of my writer friends are like, oh my God, do we also have to write about this? Like, we don't want to write about this. We don't want to explain one more time why like everyone should have full rights. Like, we're like exhausted by this explanation. We have all made it in op-eds, in essays, we're exhausted. But I thought, I cannot explain right now. I cannot plead for our humanity right now to white people. I cannot plead for women's and femme-presenting people's. I cannot plead for our humanity to men, and especially for a crime that was not just racist but also misogynist. And I thought, but I can talk to women. I want to talk to women. I want to be in spaces with women. I want to be in spaces with femme-presenting people. I want to be in spaces with the people who are most affected by this. And in that way, it was easy almost to come to, okay, then I want to write a piece that is actually directly, explicitly to Asian women. And because of that, I think any weird email I got bothered me far less. Like, it cost me a lot less, because if if some like racist dude from Lord knows where emails me, and he's white, and he tells me, if I get an email telling me, as I keep getting these emails, that the attacks weren't racist, that everything's not about racism, that the piece is naive, then I can remember that these are not the people I wrote this for, and so it's easier for me to just shove it out of my head, to remind myself why I'm doing what I'm doing. That said, I also want to say that I think, like, especially as writers, people do feel this responsibility, feel as though like we should be doing something. And I've been hearing so much from especially Asian people because of what I write about. But in the past month, I've been hearing so much from Asian people who have been saying, I feel so bad I haven't done more. I feel guilty I haven't done more. I feel guilty I haven't like given back more to the public. And all I could do is take care of my family. And it's like, oh my God, no, don't feel guilty. You're taking care of your family. Like, that's what you're taking care of yourself. Like, you have to take care of yourself first. And I wish nobody ever had to feel guilty about that, about this pressure to respond, to do something immediately in the wake of a terrible atrocity that affects a community.
Anjali and Reese, thank you so much for that. Just listening to you both speak just makes, it's been really difficult here, and we're all so raw. For me, thinking through this question had two parts. One was getting the critical knowledge, and as a young person, I had to educate myself about what is racism. How does structural systemic racism works? How does empire works? That itself was a really long process, and I think I'm still learning. And the second is locating myself and fixing myself in a space, right? For the first 27 years of my life, I didn't have a home. I left home at 17, and I never had a real home. I kept moving, and once it took me a while to realize that this was my home. These were my people. The home that I have in my head is no longer the home. I mean, it's a different home, but this was my home. This was where I had a child. This is where I've built. And I think that came home with COVID. And weeks before the George Floyd incident, the pandemic had been declared. We had walked down. I live very close to NYU. It's a pretty predominantly white, wealthy, young, a hip neighborhood. Walking down with my partner and my 4-year-old, I saw this gorgeous Black woman with her 3-year-old sing. And all of a sudden, a white woman came and threatened, find her. This is just on University and 8th. Did not like her presence there. Picked a fight with her, and within 2 minutes, threatened to call cops on her. It was this moment where I didn't know what to do, and the only thing that we could do was physically just go be next to her. And thankfully, at that moment, others came and just told this woman off. But even then, there were people who supported this woman. And this was at the heart of my community, or at least what I thought was my community, but it was not my community. The second incident happened a few months later, when at the height of the Black Lives Matter protest, I wasn't there, but my partner was there with my daughter, just outside our building. And a man who lives in our building not only yelled racial slurs at the protesters, but got into a fight. And for the first time, we felt it was important for us to bring it to our board, because New York City has these boards. And we were absolutely appalled by the fact that a white man living in the heart of New York City could openly say racial slurs in front of our building and get away with it. The board did nothing. And since then, every single time we've seen an act of racism, we've seen an act of microaggression, we've been reporting it. And every single time we've been told that, oh, not everybody is racist. Maybe, this person is going to move away. We completely understand your concern. But the point is, I don't need you to understand my concern. I need you to acknowledge my complaint. But I also understand that I come from a privilege where the very act of me speaking up matters. And I'm trying to figure out where I should speak. There was another incident where I saw someone that I went to school with take a preposterous position on Twitter when I demanded that they call out an act of racism. And this person didn't. And this person writes about white nationalism. This person writes about social justice. This is a well-respected author. And yet this person would refuse to call out a very blatant act of racism against another brown woman. And I was told that, this is not the battle you want to fight. And I didn't, because it didn't matter. Because at that moment in time, my job was to stand in solidarity with a woman who was being attacked. I'm really, I don't know if that's the right thing to do, but I'm really figuring out what it means to speak. And every time I've spoken out, nothing has come out of it. That's also another thing that I have to acknowledge. I spoke to a predominantly white board in the heart of New York City about acts of racism that I see every single day in my building. And despite my privilege, despite speaking up, I've not been able to do anything. So at those moments of failure, I do not know what I'm supposed to do next. And that's why, Anjali, someone like you is so inspirational to me. Or Reese, when I read your writing, or when I hear you say that poetry is important, I'm figuring out ways to deal with it. And I don't know what I do next, because I understand where I am, right? I understand that I'm a privileged brown woman who was definitely far more privileged than the African-American woman who was trying to sing on the corner of University and 8th, but I'm still not a white woman. My concerns, while I can flag it, will not automatically translate to something that is actionable. So I don't know, I'm really struggling with it. And that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to hear you both. And I'm so glad that I did. And so thank you for that.
Anjali, I saw you were checking in about audience questions. Should we switch to audience questions, or should I ask this other? Yeah, up to you.
I'll let you make that call, Reese. You decide what you'd like to do.
Okay, I'll ask one of the audience questions that came up then, since I know we're coming in on the hour. Okay, the one I saw was, what gives you, this was from Kelsey, what gives you hope and allows you to continue your work in difficult times?
I'm happy to start. Definitely community. I feel so buoyed by the fact that I'm not ever doing this work alone. Multiple times, I've been at my breaking point multiple times in the past year, as I know everybody has been. But especially before the elections, I remember that I will have like these little meltdowns in various chats I'm in with other local Asian American organizers, where I'm just like, oh my gosh, did you hear this? This is terrible. These numbers don't look good, or this happened at this event, or or the venue we were planning for something doesn't look like it's gonna come through, and I'm panicking, right? And I'm sending these texts at 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning. And every time, at least 2 or 3 people in that group immediately reply. And, when I was in those really dark moments, and it's literally dark outside, to know that these people always have my back, and always are there to be like, okay, you're on the verge of mental and emotional collapse in this moment, and we're going to pull you up by the armpits and carry you through to the finish line. That has always inspired me in doing this work. That's what's kept me going, are the friendships that have come from this work, the people that you have that have seen you in your truly ugliest moments, your most burned out moments, and have said, you know what, we got you. Until you figure this out, until you have the energy to keep going, we got you.
Reese, you should go next.
Maybe, let's see, because of what you said, I will also veer towards saying community. And one thing that maybe just like on the practical level of trying to write when there's so much happening, trying to write when circumstances have been so hard for so many people. So I wasn't able to write anything of my own except for like one nonfiction piece for the first couple of months of the pandemic. And then in May, I started being able to write more. And since then, I tried basically to write at least a sentence a day. And that sometimes feels like very thin, but very real lifeline, because sometimes there have been weeks when that's like almost all I write is that one sentence, but at least I'm still in touch with my work. The community part though, I also have I have an email group and a text group. And in these groups, we've all committed to writing every day, basically, and we update each other on what we worked on. I'm usually trying to write 300 words a day, which usually doesn't happen, but sometimes it does. Other people like trying to write a certain number of hours a day, etc. And just having this check-in system really changes things for me, because I realized at a certain point that I'm really good at, or at least it's really important to me not to let other people down. And then so I'm really good at keeping not breaking promises to other people. I'm equally good and equally invested in breaking promises to myself. I break 20 promises to myself a day. I'm sure I've broken 20 today, just having to do with Twitter and about my resolution not to go on. And then I go on, and then I'm just going to be on for 10 more minutes, and then I'm on for 30, and just all of that. And so the more I can replace my promises to myself with promises to other people, the more possible things have felt at times.
For me, it's definitely my community. Just having people pull you up when you're in the moment of you're in a purgatory, and then people who call your bullshit. It's very easy for all of us to, I'm speaking of myself. It's very easy for me to get in a space where I become so self-righteous that sometimes I don't really see that my anger can cloud my judgments. So I have a community, a sisterhood, who will look out for me, who will go to battle for me, but will also call my bullshit. That's one thing. Second, the work that we do at Polis Project puts me in touch with remarkable people every single day. Yes, majority of it is also annoying, but the young people who will speak for what is right. Right now in India, there's a crackdown where young people who took to the streets to fight for an illegal, unconstitutional law that would criminalize vast majority of undocumented people, or criminalize vast majority of Muslim communities who now face, who have been picked up for sedition and treason, they will still continue to fight. I have no idea what brings them courage. India's foremost intellectual, Dr. Anand Teltumde, is being arrested. It's been a year since he's been arrested. Shudha Bharadwaj, a woman who gave up a life in the United States to go back and work as a lawyer, defending the rights of Adivasi communities against the big corporations, has been incarcerated for over 2 years. I can just go on, and these people continue to fight, and they have been incarcerated under sedition laws for the simple act of standing up for people's rights in the world's largest democracy, or at least what used to be the world's largest democracy. I have no idea where their courage comes from. When I see them, it gives me hope, but I also want to be very clear that I do not want to romanticize this resilience or this courage. No one should be incarcerated for speaking up. So it's a balancing act. But mostly it's just my sisterhood. It's people who have come around, as I said, to both hold me up, but also call my bullshit, because it's very easy for, at least for me, I don't want to speak for anyone else. It's very easy for me to sometimes lose my shit. So it's always good to have the women in my life, often on a daily basis, to call my bullshit. So that's always been, that's what gives me hope.
And accountability is a form of love, right? I mean, it really is. When you have people that can be like, you really need to rethink that, or you should rephrase your language, or this isn't your moment to be in the spotlight. Can you please step back and give this to somebody else? That is so, so invaluable, I think. Mandy, I know we're close to the top of the hour. Do you think we have time for one more question, maybe? Okay. All right. So I'm looking at the next two questions I see here, and I feel like they're related. So I'm going to read them both out. One is, what do you feel are the most important mental health issues for Asian groups and Asian women? And the second one is, they'd like to know our thoughts about microaggressions being normalized and dismissed in the Asian community, especially compared to physical forms of racism. And I kind of see a little bit of a tie there. So who wants to tackle one or both of those questions?
Whew, these are both such big questions. Let's see. Okay, I'll just try to address the microaggression one. I have this ongoing, and it's just turning, like, the belief is getting stronger. I feel as though, I mean, on the one hand, the word microaggression has been very useful. On the other hand, I personally, and I'm not like a socio, I'm not, you know, like I haven't studied this in depth, but I feel as though the word microaggression makes things sound really tiny, that micro. And in my head, I actually always reword it as aggressions, because that's what it is. That's what it feels like. Our bodies, when we experience a verbal insult, when we're verbally harassed, go through the exact same sort of like we are under threat response that we do with the physical attack. And so I would just say that, like, sometimes it helps me personally inside my head to just like reword it as aggression. It's just an aggression, which is not to say that all of the fixing will come from inside our heads by any means. And I guess what I'll say about, about microaggressions being normalized, to the extent possible, I believe we can do a lot, you know, or I guess that was a really contradictory sentence. To the extent possible, I believe we can do a lot. But no, I do believe that we can, each of us, do a lot, and to speak up against that too. If you see that shift happening, then to push back against it, to not let that kind of slip happen, at least when it's around you, which I know can sometimes be easier, can sometimes be harder. But I think I've become extremely on the side of not letting a joke pass by without saying something about it, without like not letting harmful language slip past without saying something about it. And in some ways that means that some of my friendships are not as strong as they used to be. And yet others have gotten much stronger. And so I think that's been I think just continuing to be conscious of where it is I want approval from, where it is, whose eyes I want to shine in, and being clear about that, as clear as I can be in my head, has been very helpful in weathering sort of and dealing with blowback and weird mail and criticism and just the general weirdness that can come with our lives.
Okay, so I'm going to be very candid and say that often I think we need to do a lot of soul searching within our own communities. For instance, a lot of the really bad behavior that I've seen directed against both my Black and Asian sisters is often not perhaps by someone who is white, but someone who is brown or from the community, where we allow certain, again, this goes back to the question of diversity and representation, where I've seen immensely powerful gatekeepers who often happen to be people of color who do some very egregious things. This could happen in acts of gatekeeping. Sometimes it's viciously depriving someone of opportunities and fellowships. Trust me, this is things I was quite surprised to see this up front and play out many times, that even a simple act of critique saying that, hey, I don't think this is okay, could often lead to very insidious, backlash. For a long time, I thought I was thinking of all of this in my head. And now I make a very conscious effort to, as Reese said, call it out. And I think what she said was very powerful. Whose eyes do I want to shine in? And also, let's not forget that not everybody gets and has the capacity to speak out. Because often speaking out means that you're going to lose access to institutional support, fellowships. It's a very small community. It's a very small community that decides so much of what happens. I know for a fact that when for example, there are certain spaces that I would no longer speak in because I know how it's funded. I cannot speak about rights when I go, of rights or fighting for my community, and then go to a literary festival that is funded by the very people I'm critiquing, right? So there are instances where I've said no to things. And the act of saying no has cost me other things, which is fine. But again, as I said, not everybody has to speak. It's my choice. And I've seen people with far less privilege being held or their careers being destroyed, because not everybody can write. If you look at people who write, you realize that all of them either come from immense wealth, literary or cultural privilege, or have, there are very few writers who come from working class communities or come from working backgrounds. It's really hard to write. It took me 8 years to write my book because I never got funding. I would make money, go do the research, come back and run out of money. So I want to be very careful when I say that we need to call out some very terrible behavior by the very people who are supposed to be our allies or from our community. That's the first step. Second, I think we need to be there for each other. I never punch down, I always punch up. Sometimes I could see a really bad behavior, but I would be like, you know what, I'm not going to pick a fight with you in public because then I'm going to destroy the last capacity I have to have a conversation with you. So also sometimes, rightly or wrongly, picking these forums to decide. And I think that is very important for me in terms of speaking up and deciding. And this all has a very direct connection to mental health because, by God, we value ourselves based on how other people see us. Yes, I want to shine on the eyes of my community, but eventually my community also values that a very prestigious publication publishes me. Does my community value me if a community publication publishes me? No, my community values me if I appear on the pages of New York Times and New Yorker. So how does one... It's really hard. It's really hard because you have to constantly keep doing this check where you have to decide if your politics, you as a person, it's not easy. And that goes back to the sisterhood conversation where I will literally have friends of mine say, you know what, you have a first book coming out, do not pick this fight. There will be a time when you will be powerful enough and you can punch down. Right now, do not punch up. And I think these are negotiations that we, again, as I said, I'm very candid because I think these are conversations that we should be more candid about. Again, I do not know being candid now is going to cost me something, but the point is I much rather have this candid conversation now and then tell you that I don't know. Sometimes I have seen something wrong and I'm not called it out. Because I'm also a first-time author. It took me 10 years to have a book out. I'm afraid. There's certain spaces where I've said no, and I know I'll be okay. But certain spaces I'm actually afraid. I don't know if I speak up, if my book would actually get read, right? And I think those fears are real. And I think we really need to be there for each other, just as this conversation is about an active community. And I think, so I think I'll kind of leave it up there saying that, I don't know, maybe I've raised more questions than I've answered, but I think these are all important things for me and important things for all of us to acknowledge.
Both of you answered that so well. I'll be very brief since I know we're towards the end. I feel like there's such a close tie between both of those questions, both about what do we do about microaggressions and what do we do about mental health. And Suchitra, you touched on this in particular. We are not going to get our liberation from white people. So I think the first thing we have to do is have our own communities stop with the microaggressions or the denial of the microaggressions. We do it too much to each other, whatever kind of Asian we are, whether it's, Indian or Chinese or Malaysian, we do not value each other. We say things that are condescending to one another. And so we have to not only build a coalition together, but we have to openly acknowledge when someone is doing something harmful. When I bring up microaggressions, there are plenty of people in the Asian American community who will tell me it wasn't that bad, or, they didn't mean it. They didn't know. They're not as, I'll hear something ridiculous, like they're not as worldly as you, right? Some kind of gaslighty comment. So we have to be responsible for our own people and call out when they are. When I say call out, I mean just in a conversation with them. You might want to rethink how you've just taken that comment, and you need to think about how harmful it is when you dismiss something that I've said that hurts all of our communities. And I think the same goes for mental health. I think this is where, especially, it's the mental health issue is within the shadow of the model minority myth, right? And I think microaggressions are too, right? We minimize our struggles because we think we will be more accepted by white people. That's basically what we do, right? We have shame for many reasons. And yes, many of this shame is related to our oppression and white supremacy. But we also have to acknowledge that when we are not, when we are minimizing the pain that we're in or dismissing the pain that we're in, we are also part of the problem. And I hope what we can do is have more honest conversations in safe spaces within our community to address what it is that we're doing that not only hurts us, but it actually hurts all marginalized communities, including communities that are much less privileged than we are. And I think it really starts at home. I think it starts at addressing our own issues and trying to work through that in some way. And talk about the collective harm that we feel as Asians, that we feel as people of color, when we minimize the ways that we are harmed by white supremacy. And I hope we can keep having those types of conversations. So I want to thank everybody so much for being here tonight. Thank you, Reese. Thank you, Suchitra. Thank you, Mandy and Pilsen Community Books, for giving us this space. We really appreciate you hosting us tonight. And Mandy, I'd like to turn it back over to you if you have any final words.
Yes, thank you. A lot of people excited about this event, and I'm so grateful to have the three of you here. A little starstruck, so thank you. I want to reiterate, you can buy the Incendiaries, you can buy Southbound, you can pre-order Midnight's Borders at pilsencommunitybooks.com or any independent retailer. Please support these writers and their good fight. Thank you again, and I'll wish you all good night.
Thanks, everyone.